and welcome to the Bookshelf, a segment where we review the latest books pertinent to South Asia. Today, we will be talking to Mr. P S Suryanarayana, author of The Elusive Tipping Point, China-India Ties for a New Order. Mr. Suryanarayana is an Indian journalist turned researcher with over 4 decades of experience. He was a foreign correspondent for the Hindu newspaper, working successfully in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and the Asia Pacific, with Singapore as the base. He has authored 3 policy-relevant books, including 2 on the China-India puzzle. One book titled Smart Diplomacy, Exploring China-India Synergy was written during his stint at the Institute of South Asian Studies, while his recent book has been done while working at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, where he is currently an adjunct senior fellow. During his career as a journalist and now as an academic, he has interviewed a number of South and East Asian leaders, diplomats, and officials dealing with strategic affairs. The book is based on such in-person interviews, formal as well as informal. It delves deep into the reasons for frequent diplomatic and strategic crises between Asia's 2 dynamic ancient civilizations with postmodern capabilities. Welcome, Mr. Suryanarayana, and thank you for taking the time off and speaking to us from Chennai.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
So let me start right off and ask you, your book has come at a very appropriate time when the relations between China and India are at perhaps a tipping point. And therefore, it is also a good reflection of the same. So what prompted you to write this book?
Well, to begin with, it's a matter of professional excellence and the quest for professional excellence. So it is a personal choice to write a book as a follow-up on Smart Diplomacy, the book which I wrote at ISAS earlier. That is at the personal level. As far as the professional, what shall I say, timing of the book is concerned, you know, the 70th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between India and China. The anniversary dawned last year in 2020, April the 1st, unfortunately, All Fools' Day. So I thought I would update the state of affairs between China and India on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between the 2 countries. And the only thing I could think of was the relations were not in good shape, not in tune with the spirit of the 70th anniversary. So I gave the title of The Elusive Tipping Point for China-India ties to be a factor in international relations going forward. And it so happened that I was proved more than prophetic when the clash between the Chinese and Indian soldiers, or you could say Indian and Chinese soldiers from the other side's point of view, occurred at Galwan Valley in the what is generally known as the Ladakh sector. So I had to fine-tune some of the aspects of the relationship so that I will be able to take into account the significance of the Galwan Valley clash as well. So that's the context in which this book was written. And you know, tipping point has got 2 dimensions. One, it could be a negative tipping point, or it could be a positive tipping point. And tipping point, as we know, in the context of international relations, is generally an episode or a confluence of circumstances which could bring about a desired outcome in any field. And this particular field, of course, is international relations with reference to China and India. The negative tipping point is what is indicated today because of the unsettled issues in China-India relationship, particularly the military crisis, which is still ongoing as a standoff, although at the moment, as we speak, the standoff is non-lethal. But what I have been looking for is a positive tipping point. And for the purpose of a positive tipping point, I have analyzed the necessary factors. And therefore, I think the book covers both the analysis of the negative aspects of the tipping point, as well as looking to the future for a positive possibility. And let's hope the positive tipping point will occur, at least in my lifetime. Thank you for this question.
Yes, in fact, you end your very first chapter, which gives a very good historical perspective of Sino-Indian relations, with a very pertinent comment. You say the future of Sino-Indian relations will also depend on China-US ties and the strategic quotient of America's engagement with India in the 2020s and beyond. Now, could you analyze this in the present context where relations between India and the US are at a high point with the recently held Quad Summit in March and many other such developments?
Well, here I will have to agree and disagree. I agree with you in the sense that you have spotted the pertinent aspect of potential future in Sino-Indian relationship. And really, it's a good insight you could easily pick up. But there is a bit of history here. And because we may have some time to discuss, I will go into the history. Let's go back to 1971, when the US, as we say, or the United States, to be more specific, tilted towards not only Pakistan, as is generally known during the so-called Bangladesh crisis, but also towards China in a very big way. And that set the tone for Sino-American relationship going forward. That was the first time ever that an American president recognized the existence of the People's Republic of China. So in that context, as a consequence of the tilt by the US towards China, China gained a lot, and China's economic development was catalyzed, or at least the process of China's economic development was catalyzed to begin with by the American smile towards Mao at that time, And in the same year, 1971, the Soviet Union tilted towards India in a big way. That was because of the circumstances of the Bangladesh crisis, which I'm sure many people in the audience, many people who happen to read the book will be aware of. And Soviet Union's tilt towards India did not catalyze India's economic development the way the American tilt towards China catalyzed the Chinese economic development process. The reason was the Soviet Union's the Soviet Union's military tilt towards India was the factor which balanced the US-China relationship in 1971. So now going forward, there is this aspect of the United States being a factor in China-India relations over a period of time, over several decades. And it is not surprising that today the United States appears to be again a factor or a potential factor in China-India relationship going forward. There is much talk about the Quad, that is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue Forum, which consists of the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. In fact, the Quad was first suggested by Japan as a possibility way back in the in the 2000s, in the decade of 2000s. At that time, the US was not initially very enthusiastic, but then allowed it to happen. China protested. China was very insightful and was able to foresee the potentiality of a Quad being what the Chinese refer to as anti-China forum. So the Chinese protested, and Australia was not very much on board any longer after the protest. So the Quad at that time did not take off after an initial official level meeting among the four countries. It was later revived during the presidency of Donald Trump in the US, and India was a very enthusiastic supporter, and so also Japan, and this time Australia as well. So the Quad has now become a reality in international affairs in the context of Indo-Pacific, as we all know about it. But what does Quad mean for India? In terms of Quad as a factor for India to deter China, Quad is not exactly the instrumentality, because in the Quad, the US has got two very close military allies, Japan and Australia. But India is a non-ally, non-military ally of the US in the Quad and also outside the Quad. And therefore, there is that element of, if you will, inequality, or rather not all the four countries being on the same page, as it were. So Quad in that sense, I don't think can be relied upon by India as a, what shall I say, as a definitive deterrence against China going forward. That apart, there are issues in the bilateral relationship between the US and India, more so evident now during this second wave of COVID attack, the coronavirus disease 19 attack in India. India thinks of India first, obviously, and America thinks of America first, although Donald Trump is no longer in the White House. So when India has to ask America for assistance in the context of the second COVID wave in India, the Americans were seen in India to be not very enthusiastic supporters or even aid givers. Of course, the Americans have now told the Indian External Affairs Minister Subramanian Jaishankar, who visited Washington for the purpose of asking for American help to fight COVID in India. Subramanian Jaishankar was told by the American officials, all top officials of Biden administration, that they have already earmarked about $500 million in terms of value aid to India for fighting COVID-2, Mark II, as it were, in India. This includes both G2G help as well as corporate help from America and the non-governmental organizations in America, all that. Yet there is this impression in India that the US was not very forthcoming as a friend in need. So what I'm going to say is that there is a certain element of residual reservations, if you will, between US and India. Not just now, I've given the most recent example, but if you trace the history of US-India diplomatic relations, there have been a number of occasions when India was not in tune with American thinking and America was not on the same wavelength as India. So going forward, it's not definitive that Quad, which the Chinese oppose as a small clique against China, will really be a factor of great strength for India or as a deterrence against China. I think we will still have to see how this relationship between US and India, both bilaterally and within the Quad forum, will shape up. Maybe I have given too many details. We should not miss the sky, as it were, for the stars on a clear night. So what I'm saying is that we should be aware of the limitations of Quad and also US-India bilateral relations with reference to China, although it is not a negative factor altogether for India. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that perspective and for speaking things straight and as it is at the current time. But another relationship that has been developing is that of China and Pakistan. We have seen them being great friends in the recent times. And one of the pet initiatives, of course, is the Belt and Road Initiative. Your book has referred to it quite extensively. You yourself were present at the inauguration ceremony and which is, of course, part of the CPEC. Now, your book also mentions a very important, interesting fact that that China influenced Pakistan more than the US to release the Indian Air Force pilot who was caught after the Balakot attack, and that China is keen on a practical settlement of the Kashmir issue to protect the CPEC. How would you assess the current relationship between Pakistan and China, and why is the CPEC so important to China?
Well, I'll take the second part of your question first, CPEC, because CPEC is a much talked about subject, more so than China-Pakistan relations per se. CPEC, of course, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, was originally conceived both by the Chinese themselves and by the Pakistanis as a series of projects for overcoming the energy shortage in Pakistan. That was initial step, but nothing much happened. But ever since President Xi Jinping came to power, he had a vision of China becoming a benign global leader, So he updated the original idea of potential China-Pakistan economic corridor, and it became a strategic project, including economic dimension and also the strategic dimension, meaning you know what it means. So there are three dimensions of CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. The first is what is known as the Malacca dilemma for China. China, as you know, has always been very particular about ensuring the longevity of its sea routes to ensure the supply of energy products, including basic oil from the Gulf countries in West Asia, and also for general trade in goods. So Malacca Strait in Southeast Asia, a few kilometers away from where you are sitting now and where I was working for 20 years, that Malacca Strait has been a conduit for Chinese trade and even for occasional military traffic. But there was this fear, or rather concern, I would say, in China that the US might blockade the Malacca Strait in the event of a crisis between China and the US. So the Chinese were thinking of an alternative to the Malacca Strait to meet any potential crisis for China in the future. So they thought of having this route through, it's a land route this time, through Pakistan, which is supposed to be a friendly country for China. In that context, the CPEC was conceived of. And the value add for China in this sense of meeting the Malacca dilemma is the Gwadar port at the tail end of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor project. The tail end, the Gwadar port it's a port on the Arabian Sea. It's, you know that. So the Gwadar port has now been developed by China in a big way, and it is a dual usable port. Like most ports are dual usable. They can be used for civilian purposes most of the time, and when the need arises, if there is sufficient infrastructure at the port, the same port can be used for military activities in times of war. This applies to every country. It's not as though China is doing something wrong. What I'm saying is that it's a dual usable port. Of course, India suspects that China will set up an active military base in Gwadar to deter India, because Gwadar port is very close to Indian ports. Second dimension of the CPEC is to challenge India from the Chinese point of view, because the CPEC route passes through a place called Gilgit-Baltistan, which is now administered by Pakistan, but which is claimed as sovereign territory by India because of history there. I don't think we need to go into history of that particular aspect for this answer. So in that sense, because the CPEC passes through Indian territory from an Indian point of view, it's a challenge to India, both strategically and even economically, because if economic projects take off in a big way in China on the CPEC route, that it's a good thing for Pakistan. It's probably good for China as well in terms of returns on investments, as and when they get them. On the Indian side, we have this Japanese-aided project known as the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. So there is something like a parallel, CPEC on that side and the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor on the Indian side. So there is that aspect of economic challenge as well. This can spur India to develop itself. So that's the second dimension. The third dimension is, suppose the CPEC succeeds in making Pakistan economically viable and vibrant. Suppose it does. Then for President Xi Jinping and for China, it would be a great showpiece project to project their mantra of win-win cooperation with other countries. The win-win cooperation also has some history. Win-win cooperation has not been well defined. It doesn't say that win-win would mean equal win for both sides. It doesn't say even equivalent win, but it means both sides can win something or other. So these are the three dimensions of CPEC, and therefore CPEC, from the Chinese point of view and from the Pakistani point of view, has come to stay. Although India is opposed to CPEC because it passes through Indian territory from the Indian point of view. Now coming back to the basic relationship between Pakistan and China, of course, they were originally all-weather friends. Then they updated it during President Xi Jinping's visit to Pakistan in 2015 to all-weather strategic cooperative partnership. Earlier, they were just strategic friends, all-weather friends, now all-weather partners. That's from the Pakistani point of view, it's very good because China is a big country and potentially a global leader, already knocking at the doors of the US to asking US to vacate the number one spot, as it were. This is just metaphorically speaking. So coming back to this, the relationship so far, China-Pakistan relationship, no one has spotted any black swan so far. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't lurk in the corner somewhere. But I'm not predicting that it should happen or will happen. Nobody can predict it at the moment. So in this particular context of not having seen any black swan on the horizon, as it were, China-Pakistan relations are in pretty good shape. But if China wants to be a global leader, acceptable to many other countries, they may have to recalibrate, the Chinese, may have to recalibrate the relations with Pakistan at some stage. When that will happen, whether it will happen is only the Chinese will know. That is, the leadership of China will know. Thank you.
Another interesting link that you make is that of the Tibetan and Kashmir issues. You've written a whole chapter on Tibet especially. And you say that there is an interesting similarity, and you've said that just as President Xi affirms the finality of Tibet and Xinjiang as integral parts of China, Modi's India also asserts its authority on Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, which would in turn include Aksai Chin. Going forward, how would these shape the relationship between the two neighbors?
To begin with, are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
To begin with, India does not contest the finality of Tibet and Xinjiang as integral parts of People's Republic of China. There are some voices in India to the contrary, but government of India or the state of India has not, certainly not so far, gone back on recognizing Tibet as an integral part of China, as well as Xinjiang. Of course, Xinjiang was never a big issue between India and China. So in that context, President Xi Jinping's assertion of finality does not really affect India in any manner, because India has no particular dispute with China in terms of these two areas being parts of China. There are other issues regarding Tibet because Dalai Lama is in India, and that is the Tibetan leader. Dalai Lama is in India, and there is the so-called Tibetan government in exile, quote unquote, which of course China does not recognize, that operates with the blessings of Dalai Lama, and China is opposed to Dalai Lama as a leader of Tibet. So that's a different aspect. Sometimes those issues come into play in China-India relations, but not so much officially, at least not in recent times. As far as India's, that is Prime Minister Narendra Modi's reconfiguration of the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir into reconfiguration of that as two union territories, that is federally controlled territories, namely the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir, and then there is this Union Territory of Ladakh, where India believes, on the basis of historical records as understood by Indian government, India believes that the Union Territory of Ladakh should include Aksai Chin. Originally, Aksai Chin was the area through which China built a road, strategic road between Xinjiang and Tibet in the 1950s. So the Chinese position today is that even the Union Territory of Ladakh is, according to the Chinese, null and void, But India does not accept, India rejects that proposition altogether. So there is a dispute over that aspect. But how this dispute will be resolved is, of course, not easy to predict. But they can continue to discuss the historical aspects about who really is entitled to which area in this China, Pakistan, India triangle. That is actually, it will be, if you see from the west, it is Pakistan, India, China triangular neighborhood. In that neighborhood depends on which leader thinks what can be achieved. Thank you.
You have also covered the Doklam crisis quite extensively in great detail. And towards the end, there is a reference to the Galwan face-off as well. And both these scuffles or both these issues were settled through civil-military diplomacy. Could you firstly elaborate on this form of negotiation and what did China eventually achieve through these confrontations? Can India construe these settlements as a victory for itself?
The Doklam Crisis and the Galwan clash, of course, are more recent events in China-India relationship. And civil-military diplomacy is not a magic wand, as it were. It simply means that, the civilian officials of India and the civilian officials of China talk to each other across the table to settle the issue, not necessarily Doklam alone or any issue for that matter. And the military officials, whenever there is a military crisis or a military skirmish or whatever, they also have been in recent years talking to each other to defuse the tensions. One can ask, why start a military crisis and then try to defuse? But these are all, academic questions or philosophical questions, but it doesn't happen in that fashion of, perfection in reality in international relations. So crises do occur in relations between countries, especially between neighbors. So the Doklam crisis was different because the Doklam area is not an area contested by India and China. It is an area contested by China and Bhutan. Of course, the Chinese version is that it is Chinese territory, sovereign territory. The Bhutanese have said during the Doklam crisis that it is Bhutanese territory. And India went to help Bhutan on that occasion because India has a strategic treaty with Bhutan to help Bhutan, defend itself when in crisis. So that's the context in which the Doklam crisis happened, although it was outside of the China-India boundary, which is still unsettled in any case. And it was diffused through talks between the civilians on one side, the military officials on the other side. And there is also a mechanism called working mechanism between, of course, it's a long-winded terminology. I'm just shortening it to working mechanism, which was set up in 2012 between India and China. That mechanism consists of civilian officials as well as military officials from both sides. So that is where the civil military officials sit together to sort out issues. And that was used to defuse the Doklam crisis. And that has been used to defuse the Galvan crisis as well in 2020, after it first erupted in mid-2020. So this is the state of affairs. This has been successful so far, and one hopes that it will be successful in terms of an instrumentality for both India and China to settle the existing disputes. There are still many disputes between India and China along their own disputed boundary as to where each one should be located at any given point of time before the boundary is finally determined by the two sides through special representatives negotiations. So if, as I said, if China wants to be a global power, a benign global power, and India wants to be a very exemplary major power, civil military mechanism is probably a first step. Thank you.
And finally, your last part of the book touches upon two very recent developments. One is, of course, 5G technologies and the COVID-19 pandemic, which have in a way divided the world as well when it comes to China. How do you see the international order changing going forward?
Well, that's a big question, and it cannot be answered easily by, I suppose, even the leaders themselves. That is a way of saving my answer from any attack. Yes, you are right in saying that the 5G technology for telecommunications, which of course has other applications as well, according to people who are aware of the subject, and the COVID crisis, which has become a global pandemic after being originally an epidemic. Originally an epidemic. These two crises have certainly divided the world. And rightly or wrongly, I would say, as an observation, as a dispassionate observation, China is in the eye of the storms, both the storms. In the case of 5G, China is in the eye of the storm because China has succeeded in developing 5G technology to a point of excellence, which countries like the US and perhaps Japan have taken serious note of. And in the case of COVID crisis, China is in the eye of the storm as, because of the allegations across the world, especially in the Western world, allegations that, I emphasize the word allegations because China does not accept what the allegation is about. The allegation that China was the place where the COVID crisis began, So that is the allegation which China has vehemently denied and disputed and continues to do so. In any case, in that sense, China is in the eye of this COVID storm as well, So given these two crises, especially the COVID crisis, which has affected the entire world, it is easy to imagine that new world order is a must, because the existing world order has not helped prevent the global public health disaster. And also there have been voices even earlier from very many countries that the existing world order is not satisfactory to the entire world, Well, it's again a philosophical question whether any order evolved at any time will be acceptable to all countries in equal measure at all times. That's really difficult. But at the moment, the United Nations is the core of the existing international order. But the United Nations has got a fundamental flaw. That is to say, there is within the United Nations Security Council, you have a caucus of 5 countries who are known as the Permanent 5, P5. They include People's Republic of China today, although People's Republic of China, I emphasize People's Republic of China, was not originally a member of P5. It was a pre-PRC regime, which was originally a member of the P5. Similarly, Russia is today a P5 member. Originally, it was Soviet Union, not today's Russia. So that's one aspect. And P5, one can see, is a citadel of vested interests because all the 5 members have got veto right, individual veto right. So they can overrule any decision of any United Nations organization, they call it organ, or even the majority view in the United Nations can be overruled by one veto of one of the P5 members. This obviously is a flaw in the system. Why it was created and how it was created is history that we need not go into at this moment, but it's a fact of life. So there are countries like India, Japan, Germany, and several other countries like South Africa and others who oppose the existing P5 as a citadel of vested interests. So they would like this P5 to be enlarged to include themselves. That is, India wants to be an enlarged P5 member, Japan, as well as Germany, Brazil, South Africa, and perhaps a few other countries can be considered. So I have a suggestion. I don't know whether anyone will be able to implement it, and certainly the existing P5 members with veto right can really say they will not agree to it. But whatever it is, it's a sensible suggestion. We have at the moment G20, that is a group of 20 countries, which consists of economies. Basically, it's an economic forum to determine the existing state of economic affairs in the world, especially during crisis, and to find a solution for the future, immediate future mostly. So that G20 members, the G20 can itself be transplanted in the United Nations Security Council as a new enlarged P5. I mean, I'm using the word P5 for want of a better term. Yeah. So coming back to this, G20 can be transplanted in the existing United Nations Security Council for organizing the security affairs of the world, because G20 countries represent a vast majority of the economic wealth of the world. So in that sense, it's not an exclusive club totally, although it is also an exclusive club, but it cannot be treated on par with the exclusivity of P5 in terms of negative perception. So I suppose this is an idea which could be considered going forward.
Thank you so much, Mr. Suryanarayana, for joining us today. It was a pleasure having you at the bookshelf.
Thank you very much.